As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
War.com today, the U.S. says that the main thrust of Ukraine's counteroffensive has started. So U.S. officials told the New York Times on Wednesday that the main thrust of Ukraine's counteroffensive has begun, while the U.S. military reported a massive Ukrainian tank attack in the southern Zaporozhye Oblast. So unnamed Pentagon officials told the Times that Ukraine has poured in thousands of troops who are being held in reserves to the front lines, and most of these troops have received NATO training in European countries ahead of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So the Russian Defense Ministry said that there was heavy fighting to the south of Orikhiv, which is a Ukrainian-controlled town in Zaporozhye. A Russian Defense Ministry spokesman said that Ukrainian forces carried out a massive attack by 3 battalions reinforced by tanks. He said, quote, all of the Ukrainian army's attacks were repelled by courageous and professional actions, end quote. He also claimed that Russian forces destroyed 22 tanks, 10 infantry vehicles, and an armored combat vehicle, and over 100 Ukrainian personnel. So if you're watching the video here, you see this is a map of the Zaporozhye region from South Front, and you can see this is where the bulk of the fighting happened to the south of this town. So it looks like this is a big attack here from the Ukrainian side. And according to the New York Times, Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the southern front said that they'd been steadily pushing against Russian troops, steadily pushing them back, but they said the progress has been incremental with no major breakthroughs. So this new push appears to be, a last-ditch effort to break through after the first phase of the counteroffensive had been unsuccessful. Ukraine's goal is to sever the land bridge that Russia has secured from Crimea to the Russian mainland, and Ukrainian officials are telling the U.S. that the new operation could take 1 week to 3 weeks if it is successful. A U.S. official told the New York Times that this is the big test, so the U.S. is kind of banking on this succeeding, or at least the Ukrainians are. As we know from what I've been covering lately, Ukrainian success seems unlikely. The Wall Street Journal reported over the weekend that Western officials did not believe Ukraine had enough weapons or training in the first place for this counteroffensive to dislodge Russian forces. And leading up to the counteroffensive, the Discord leaks media reports have showed us that the U.S. did not think Ukraine could regain much territory. But this kind of signals that this counteroffensive only has a few more weeks left. And, unless they do really break through, which again seems unlikely, it's not clear, what's going to happen after that next few weeks. So the North Atlantic Alliance will step up its aerial surveillance of Russian activity in the Black Sea as tensions in the region rise. Moscow recently withdrew from the Black Sea grain export agreement and warned that it would consider civilian ships potentially carrying military supplies to Kiev. On Tuesday, at a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council, Alliance head Jens Stoltenberg announced the increase in Black Sea operations. He said, quote, Russia's actions also pose substantial risks to the stability of the Black Sea region, which is of strategic importance to NATO. Allies are stepping up support to Ukraine and increasing our vigilance. We remain ready to defend every inch of Allied territory from any aggression, end quote. In a press release, NATO explained that the increased vigilance will come in the form of spy plane and drone flights. The statement said, quote, NATO and allies are stepping up surveillance and reconnaissance in the Black Sea region, including with maritime patrol aircraft and drones, end quote. Stoltenberg went on to attack the Kremlin for withdrawing from that grain agreement. And again, Russia says they pulled out because they weren't happy that the UN and the West didn't live up to its end of the deal, which was to make it easier for Russia to export grain and fertilizer. So this is, the Black Sea is always kind of a potential area, potential flashpoint for a conflict between the U.S. and Russia, NATO and Russia. If you remember, not that long ago, a American drone was downed after an encounter with Russian fighter jets. So, something like that happens with 2 manned, jets. Say if it was an American pilot that was in there and the plane went down, that could really spiral into something really quickly. And there is a lot of encounters still between Russian and NATO aircraft, not just over the Black Sea, but, in the Baltic Sea as well. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the Pacific island nation of Tonga for the first time on Wednesday and took aim at China, blasting Beijing's activities in the region as predatory and problematic. He said at a joint press conference with Tonga's prime minister, quote, as China's engagement in the region has grown, there has been some, from our perspective, increasingly problematic behavior, end quote. He warned against Chinese investments, claiming that Beijing was behind, quote, some predatory economic activities, and also investments that are done in a way that can actually undermine good governments and promote corruption, end quote. So Tonga is located about 1,000 miles north of New Zealand and consists of about 170 islands, has a population of just over 100,000. Blinken's trip marks the first official visit to the country by a U.S. Secretary of State, as the U.S. is looking to boost ties with Pacific Island nations as part of its strategy against China. So the U.S. Marine Corps has activated its first Tomahawk cruise missile battery, which is a system that was previously banned by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that's the INF Treaty, which the U.S. withdrew from in 2019. So the INF banned ground-launched missile systems with a range between 310 and 3,400 miles. The new Marine Corps missile battery will use Tomahawk missiles with a range of about 1,000 miles. So the battery is the first of 4 batteries called the long-range missile batteries that the Marine Corps plans to procure. This was activated at a base in California, but they're likely going to be eventually deployed to Japan or in other areas where in Asia where missiles can reach China. That's the whole idea. They're developing this to put them along what they call the first island chain, which includes Japan.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
You know, you have an article that's coming out tomorrow. Has liberty, again, you know, this is what I was just saying, how we lost our liberty. Has liberty died in our hearts? Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. This is Judge Leonard Hand, 1872 to 1961. Boy, the cat lived a long time. You go on to say, last week, a judge on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court revealed that he had enough of the FBI and Congress trashing the Constitution. The normally secretive court and the normally secretive judge explained in a rare public opinion the unlawful behavior of the FBI agents, you ready? Spying on ordinary Americans in violation of the Fourth Amendment. The FISA judge revealed that the FBI has spied illegally on nearly 300,000 Americans in 2022.
Correct. And among them was a United States senator, not named publicly, but they have told the senator who he is, a state senator and a state judge. I'll tell you about the state judge in a minute. It's scandalous what happened to him. So right after 9/11, the most incompetent president in the modern era, George W. Bush, in order to deflect attention from his own sleepiness in the days leading up to 9/11, began to blame everybody and everything for 9/11. And the principal object that he blamed was the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment. Same Constitution he took an oath to uphold. He persuaded Congress to override the Fourth Amendment, which Congress does not have the authority to do, and tell the FBI and the NSA, you can go ahead and spy on foreigners in the U.S. without suspicion and without a warrant, just because they're foreign. Then the law says, what happens if foreigners speak to Americans? Well, if foreigners communicate with Americans, you got to take that data and put it in a database, and the FBI can only access that data with a search warrant. The FISA court judge revealed that in 2022 alone, just last year, the FBI accessed that database without a search warrant almost 300,000 times. Now, those are innocent Americans, could be you and me, could be the people watching and listening to us now. There's no search warrant on them. There's no suspicion about them. There's no knowledge of who they are. But the FBI, which is given custody of the database, couldn't resist the temptation to go in there without a search warrant. And it happened that many times. State trial judge observed criminal behavior by local police, violating the civil rights of people in his courtroom. He complained to local authorities. They told him to go take a hike. He filed a formal complaint with the FBI. And what did the FBI do? Spied on him. You can't make this stuff up. So the point of my article is we are losing liberty. This came out on Saturday morning. The judge revealed it on Friday afternoon. There was no debate over the weekend. It was buried in the back pages of the newspapers. It wasn't even in any of the major websites. Why? Because the government's violations of the Constitution today have become so regular, consistent, and systematic that they don't shock any longer. And the more the government does this, it's just another step on the stairway to totalitarianism. The more they do this, the more they can get away with it. And the public needs to know about this. Now, this law that was passed under Bush that allows the spying without warrants on foreigners, even if they spy on Americans, expires Christmas time in 5 months. And Congress is deciding what to do about it. And Congressman Jim Jordan, Republican of Ohio, who happens to be the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, is a fierce opponent of Section 702. It may very well go down. Biden, of course, is in favor of it. The big government people in the Republican and Democratic parties in Congress are in favor of it. The people in Congress that the intelligence community has dirt on, which is almost all of them, they're in favor of it. We'll see what happens.
Guy. That shows you how low America has gone. And what did you say that of all the presidents, he was probably, what did you say?
The least competent in the post-World War II era.
Yeah.
But he shrewdly used fear of another 9/11 as an instrument to pass the Patriot Act, to amend the FISA Act, and to curtail our liberties. And we all know that liberties, once curtailed, don't come back. Once the government gets their hands on our freedom, the government is fighting maniacally to get this Section 702 reinstated. I'll tell you a funny story because it involves Donald Trump. This thing expires every 5 years. So 5 years ago, Trump was in the White House. I was still at Fox. The House and the Senate had passed the reenactment of it. Trump had one more day to sign it or veto it. I was hosting Fox and Friends in the morning. I looked in the camera. I said, Mr. President, this law that they want you to sign, this is the same authority they used to spy on you when you were in Trump Tower. And my bosses were pissed off at me, but I said it anyway. Trump tweets, I'm not signing it. Well, in the next hour, Mike Pence, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell go running to the Oval Office. And they say to Trump, don't believe the judge. He thinks the Constitution means what it says. Trump sends me a message. They twisted my arm. I had to sign it.
The hypocrisy. So going back to what you're saying here is that we have lost our freedom. And that if people don't unite and stand up for it, then we're finished. Because you went back and I wrote what you said about Bush, about how he got these clowns to sign what he wanted, and he sold fear.
Correct.
Fear is what gets the people.
Right.
88% of the people believed him. We're going to get that guy Osama bin Laden dead or alive. So now let's go back now. I think we are in for another fear crisis in the run-up to the 2024 elections to get the people off the minds off the people of the clowns, the jerks that are running this country, so they can keep staying in control and robbing us of our freedom.
I agree with you. I don't know in what form it's going to take. It may be nuclear,
Yep.
but obviously old Joe is poking and prodding the bear. I mean, he just called up 3,000 reservists, a relatively small number, but guess where they're going? Poland.
Yeah.
Reservists from New York, New Jersey, and Texas are going to Poland? For what?
For what?
The Polish army is at the border, and it can't wait to go into Ukraine. It would be suicidal if they did that. But the Polish leadership is prodding them on. There.
Page of today's Wall Street Journal, big picture on the top, showing a Russian jet. Russian jet shoots down American drone over Syria.
What the hell are we doing in Syria?
We have no right being there.
Correct.
Oh, you mean we're stealing their oil? Is that what you're telling me?
Gerald, did Congress declare war on Syria, and did we miss that declaration of war?
We're getting them ISISes over there, don't you know? We're fighting ISIS. We're stealing their oil.
Right.
We are invaded a foreign nation that is no threat to us.
Correct. Well, we've been doing that for 150 years, but we're still doing it.
Yep. Yeah, so it goes back to the conclusion of your article that if we are no longer outraged at the most obvious violations, if we elect to office those who promise to uphold it and reelect them after they've trashed it, we must recognize that we have lost freedom in our hearts, and then it is gone.
So we're going to conduct this experimentation to see what its effects will be on our workers and on the public. That was the cover story. But essentially what they were doing, yeah, it'd be useful to get that data to help protect our people. But really what we're doing here, and this was referenced in a letter written by Oppenheimer himself, asking, he said, quote, "I think that we should not attempt a plan unless we can poison food sufficient to kill 500,000 men, since there is not doubt that the actual number affected will, because of non-uniform distribution, be much smaller than this." So in these letters where they're talking about doing these human experimentations involving plutonium, he's talking about using it to kill and poison people offensively. And where it really ties into the Manhattan Project itself is, there's this age-old adage, Scott, that you've confronted yourself in your work that, well, we had to drop atom bombs on those people because they never would have surrendered, and we needed to destroy Japan's will to resist, or else we were going to have to invade the island and lose 1 million people. So therefore, all of it was justified. Well, I really try to combat that ends justify the means approach by saying, look, I mean, they're not people who have the best of intentions. I mean, look at here, before the project started, they picked all these scientists who were involved in destroying medical ethics and doing Nazi-style medical experimentation on people, subjecting them to radiation without expectation of medical benefit, without informed consent. Meanwhile, the United States after the war was prosecuting war criminals at Nuremberg for doing the same exact thing. So how can you sit there and tell me that these people had the best of intentions when they were engaging in this ridiculous human experimentation, like injecting people with plutonium without their knowledge? Civilians.
Man, and then so you have a whole section on the Manhattan Project itself and the development of the A-bomb, or you stick to all these kind of side experiments on people?
I try to give the background too. Essentially the veil of secrecy that went around the Manhattan Project, talking about its development, at least enough to give the background and the context of where these took place. Because a lot of people, when they think of the Manhattan Project, they think of Los Alamos itself, but actually it was a nationwide coordinated project with different facilities around the country. And I think one of the most important parts about that was that this human experimentation was consciously decided by Oppenheimer to conduct the medical experimentation off-site at Los Alamos to kind of, it wasn't at Los Alamos, it was off-site of Los Alamos at these different affiliated universities. And so like the University of Rochester, UC Berkeley, were two sites where these programs were coordinated through. But I just thought it was really important, at least in part one, to give that background, but to say like, well, who the hell are these people? Why were they selected to be part of the Manhattan Project, and what are their backgrounds? And I think that going through, and Lisa Martino-Taylor does this in her book, Behind the Fog, goes through and really illustrates that these people who were selected weren't necessarily the most qualified people for the job. I mean, Louis Hempelman, like I said, he was 29 years old. He wasn't a physicist really at all. And he only had, I think, 2 years experience working with radiation or radioactive substances at all before he was named to be the medical director of the Manhattan Project itself. And furthermore, Oppenheimer, who, of course, is the subject of this new blockbuster film that IGN called a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, he was someone who had a checkered past. I mean, he was diagnosed with profound schizophrenia. He was like collapsing to the floor and rolling around at the Cambridge University labs. He tried to poison his professor with cyanide. He tried to strangle his best friend. He was a communist. And all these other doctors, like I document in the show, they had all engaged in human experimentation with radioactive substances.
Thinking back on it, this is some of the first stuff, I don't know, going back to when I was younger anyway, that I was exposed to this kind of thing. That, sort of like when I first learned about how like Wall Street and the rise of Hitler and that kind of thing, is in like all the army experiments on Americans, including germ weapons and radioactive stuff and whatever after the beginning of the Cold War, post-World War II era there. And I remember Bill Curtis on Investigative Reports on A&E had done some really good stuff on this. And I'd read, I don't know, whatever about it now. But that goes to show you who these people are and what they really think of us. I don't want to cite the numbers, I don't know, but there have been studies that show, however many thousands or more people who got cancer from all of the atomic testing that our government did in Nevada. Nuking the Marshall Islands out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is pretty bad and led to a lot of fallout too. But they nuked Nevada hundreds of times with A-bombs. And, people downwind from that got cancer. So this is our security force building up this nuclear stockpile in the name of staving off the Soviet Union as a threat to the American people. They're literally killing people in very large numbers. I think it really was the millions over the decades who were said to have died premature deaths of cancer from that. And here I said I wasn't going to cite numbers, but that's the way I remember it. But anyway, it was certainly way too many. And, talking about giving radioactive oatmeal to retarded kids or whatever, that's the ultimate. I don't know specific footnotes on that, but I remember something like that. Putting germs in army cars and driving around New York City with a fake tailpipe, and then shooting germs out the back to see how effective it would be. And infecting, they're like, well, we got to test this thing. So they tested on New York City, the city they're supposedly trying to protect from something like that happening. And they're like, well, we'll just try it on them. Who's the bad guy then? Whole thing is bananas, man.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, there was the way I really discovered this and what I bought Lisa Martino-Taylor's book for was to do research into the zinc cadmium sulfide experiments done by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. And I think, this was the mid-50s through the late 1960s. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps drove through a bunch of cities in North America, spraying zinc cadmium sulfide out the back with huge blowers to do like a biological agent test. And it's just insane. I mean, that they would do this in trying to, create a situation. It was a tracer experiment, but try to find comparable cities in the U.S. to Russia, USSR, cities in the USSR. And a lot of people were claimed to be sickened and given cancer by this, but there was a lawsuit that happened, but of course it was thrown out under sovereign immunity, where you can't sue the U.S. government unless they consent, the sovereign government.
Yep. Even though it says right there in the First Amendment that you can petition for a redress of grievances, they go, no, that just means you sign your name on a piece of paper begging, please, when that's not what that meant when they ratified that. But anyway, they do whatever they want.
Now the government and the defendant are in my courtroom, and they both want the same thing. There is no dispute. The government says, we agree to the plea deal. The defendant says, we agree to the plea deal. Most judges would say, okay, plea deal is accepted, because the judicial job is not to make law. It's not to make public policy. It's not to say who's good and who's bad. It's to resolve disputes. And if there is no dispute, the case is over. That's the way most judges would look at it. When I was on the bench, I did not do that. When I was on the bench, I took the position, I am not a potted plant. And if I think that the penalty is too harsh, or the penalty is too light, or the agreement is to a crime that the defendant really didn't commit, it's just a made-up crime in order to get rid of the case, I'm not going to accept it. Today, the judge in the case was of that latter mentality to which your humble correspondent belonged when he was on the bench. And she basically said a couple things. One, what does the gun have to do with the tax cases? It really should be two separate cases, and I'm uncomfortable resolving both. And two, here's the kicker. Are there any other charges about to come down the pike against Hunter Biden? Now, when she said that, the defense said no, and the government said maybe. And then the defense said, well, what do you mean maybe? The purpose of this guilty plea is to resolve all of the cases against Hunter Biden in one place before one judge at one time. So then she says, oh, you guys got to talk more, because if the government has more cases, you need to know about it. Maybe you don't want him to plead to these cases. Maybe you want a universal settlement. Defense counsel, this is a universal settlement. The government told us that by entering these pleas today and entering this pretrial intervention program today, the government is finished with Hunter Biden. The government, no, we never told you that. And there are some other things we're investigating, and we may bring other charges against him. That's what caused the judge to say, okay, I am not rejecting the guilty plea forever. I'm just rejecting it today. I think you guys and gals should get together and sit down and resolve this. Now, the judge did not say what I'm about to say. There is a principle of law called the entire controversy doctrine. And it basically says, if you're going to sue somebody, you have 5 causes of action against them, you can't sue them for one and resolve it and then sue them for the other 4. You got to bring all 5 at once. If you're going to prosecute somebody and you got 5 causes of action, you can't prosecute them for 3 and hold 2 back. You got to prosecute them for all 5 at once. You got to lay your cards on the table. We're not playing games here. So if the government has more potential charges against Hunter Biden under the Constitution, he's entitled to know what those charges are. And the government is required to lay them out so that when a guilty plea is entered, it's a universal guilty plea. It ends all the prosecutions against him. I don't know what defense counsel knew when they walked into the courtroom this morning. The government says defense counsel knew there were more charges coming. Defense counsel says, no, we didn't. You specifically told us this is it. The judge doesn't know. But the judge, in my opinion, did absolutely the right thing.
Special type of program today?
That's right. You get put in the hot seat. And this is a very popular thing that we've done here. And it's where we let our viewers ask some questions and get your take on some things. Ask Ron Paul, we call it, as our viewers know. So let's go right to the questions. Let me ask this question. Which historical event do you think was most significant in our drift from more freedom to more fascism? From our COVID response all the way back to the forming of the Union and everything in between.
It's a big question because there have been so many events. There's been a lot of gradualism, and the founders, expected that to happen and warned us against it, because the document of the Constitution was there to prevent this from happening. But they also knew about the imperfection of man, where people, bend the rules, and soon after they get their liberties, they undermine them. But I would say the first century or so, things did pretty well. But a lot of people now think about the very current events going on, and that would be, the violation of our civil liberties with COVID, and also the things going on, with this insanity about globalism, and also the idea of weather and the problems that we have there. But I would say that even in the first 100 years, we had problems. Certainly, there was a challenge to the Republic during the Civil War period, and there are some people who believe we never fully recovered from that. But the whole country was torn apart, but we did survive that, and we went back to a decent system up until the 20th century. But during that time, I would say it was that period of time that the real erosion of the Republic occurred, and it really opened up the door to a more fascist system. And that was with the progressive era, because I think most things are a result of bad ideas and education. But the educational system in this country changed in the progressive era, and then also the taking over during the 20th century of our government school system has led to the ideology that actually tolerates a system that challenges a republic. And that has been going on for a long time. The Department of Education is good symbolism for what it gets established to challenge the republic that we had. But more recently, I've done some thinking on this and a little bit of writing about a sort of an invisible coup that has gone on, where the Republic has just been taken from us, and there's been certain events that have been bad, but there's been some that are bigger than other. And I think the coup that I'm talking about is something that I remember the beginning of, and that is the 1960s. I think it was a big event in the 1960s to have the assassinations of RFK and JFK, and also Martin Luther King. And this involved not just miscellaneous isolated individuals who do a shooting for various reasons, but it was a strategic destruction of the government. I'm convinced our government was involved, the FBI was involved, and the evidence seems to me to be overwhelming. So that, to me, I think introduced a new era of the disintegration of our republic.
Pete on Twitter, and he asked a question. This is interesting, and I was actually really curious as to what your answer might be on this. He said, what is a political position or worldview that you have changed your opinion on in your lifetime?
But where I really had a significant change in the government's role as an enforcer of violent crimes. And I've seen the government, since I first got into politics, dealing with the death penalty. And I was naturally, in a way, I thought it was natural, be favorable for the death penalty. These are bad people. They kill people. They deserve the death penalty. And then as time went on, I found out that governments are so imperfect. You find out that people have been in prison for 50 years, DNA samples come out, and they were really innocent, and all these things. And I thought, well, that's overboard, to have the death penalty by the government because they're liable to make some mistakes. So I changed my position to virtually opposed to the death penalty, especially when the federal government is involved. But that doesn't make me opposed to defending our family and our relatives and our household. So if somebody comes in one's house, I believe in the death penalty that is done in self-defense. That's different than this organized death penalty that goes on for months, and then overlooking the possibility of how many mistakes have they made. I mean, just think of now in this day and age where we have a corrupt Department of Justice and FBI agents doing things they shouldn't be doing, is more reason to think that we should be very, very cautious. And for that reason, I did have a significant change, but I did not give up the idea that you have a right to self-defense.
He said, if the Federal Reserve and the country as we know it collapsed tomorrow, how would you go about rebuilding it into a functional place where both sides of the country could agree to disagree? So when the collapse comes, how can we rebuild in the best way?
Well, in many ways, I would say for myself, I will continue to do the things that I've done ever since I became aware of the problems that we faced, even before I ever went to Congress. And that is, ideas have to be changed. I mean, as long as we see these problems coming up, the Federal Reserve created by the Federal Reserve and deficit financing, tinkering on the edges and saying, well, we've got to reduce the budget by 5% here, and we have to have better monitoring of the Fed. I don't believe in any of that, because that's not going to work. I think what I started to do early on, being exposed to the freedom movement by Leonard Reed at the Foundation for Economic Education, it's that understanding, because you can't do what you have to do do if the people have no idea and they think you're doing it, making everything worse? If you come up and say, the solution to this problem today is not spending more money and bailing out people on welfare and all these problems, bankruptcies going on, all these problems caused by government. They have to understand what you're doing, and then what you want to do is, there's quite a few things you can do, and that is start reducing the size and scope of government. And that's where you run into the political problems, because you face, the resistance. Under today's conditions, it'd be very difficult for you to take one day and say, all right, no more Fed, no more this, and just go on. I mean, there would be a pretty violent reaction to that. But you could say, look, the first thing we're going to do is get rid of the income tax and reduce this. Another thing is where we ought to cut is get rid of all the corporate welfareism. I went to Congress thinking welfareism was those people who wouldn't work and got their food stamps for free. Well, I changed my attitude about that, because the real welfare benefits were the banks and big governments and the pharmaceutical industries, the military industrial complex. I would say cut it off, and you could save a lot of money. Cut off the foreign policy of marching around the world and maintaining this empire. If you want to help the people at home, quit wasting so much money overseas. That could be essentially immediate. And the biggest thing is restore confidence in the government. If people believe you're going to do it and you do it, all of a sudden the confidence, well, things are bad and it's going to be tough, but if we do this, he convinced me, things will get better. Just getting the confidence factor. But where's the confidence factor today? Okay, you're having a break-in your house or your store. Let's call the FBI and let's call the police and all this stuff. People, they don't do that, because right now, sometimes if somebody breaks in a store and you try to resist, if you resist, you might have a greater punishment than the people who robbed the store. Even if you capture or hurt the person doing the robbing, the whole thing is turned on that. So people need to know the confidence that the government has returned to sanity, and that would go a long way. But there would be a lot of things you do. But there should be a merit system, an incentive system, like what we had when people were settling this country. They didn't have all this nonsense going on. They didn't say, you know what, this is a big nation. We need a lot of bureaucrats to help tell us what to do. And how are we going to do all these things? No, you want to get rid of the bureaucrats. As a matter of fact, what you want to do is make sure people understand, the issue of the Constitution about privacy, property rights, and also the Second Amendment, you being responsible for your safety. So, but I would say education about how economics works, and also having a government that you can trust.
Every once in a while, you see a candidate get up and start talking, telling the truth, and it's all not pie in the sky stuff. It's the truth. The pie in the sky can come. If you do this, things can get better. People need to know and understand and believe that the philosophy you're following is worth standing up for. But they'll say, oh no, my prices are too high, and we don't need to deal with the Fed. We need the Fed to print more money and pass it out so we can buy bread. That's where the insanity is. So education is the big issue, and trustworthiness in government is a big issue too. And trust and having a moral group of people who will support those in government that will do these things. That seems to be tough love. But I'll tell you what, if we don't, we're going to have real bad chaos. But where I'm optimistic is there's a lot more education going on, talking about sound economic policies. I even see signs that people are saying, why are we spending so much money in Ukraine? Why don't we protect our borders? That's healthy. And why do we see these big demonstrations? Are they violent? No, they say, we don't like our companies supporting the woke movement, so therefore we're not going to use their product anymore. I think that's great. So that kind of stuff is moving in the right direction. But can you imagine if you had a few people in leadership in Washington talking about this, helping to convince people that they can't trust in the government? One reason we couldn't go back on the gold standard today like we did in 1875, what they did in 1875, they got rid of the greenbacks and they balanced the budget and they didn't have any wars overseas. And the people believed the government. And it was a non-event. They went back on the gold standard after three years. But now, what would you say, some of the things I'm suggesting, if you said that and you didn't understand that the people have to know why you're saying this and what it's going to do, it's not going to work, because people won't believe the government. The people kept saying, well, Ron, I bet you saved some gold. What if the government said tomorrow they're going to back the dollar up at $2,500 an ounce? Which is above what the market says it is now. $2,500 an ounce. Would you turn in your gold to get $2,500? No, and I don't think anybody else would either, because $2,500 is going to be a lot more, because we're still printing money faster and faster. So there's a lot we can do, but it's in education and a restoration of trust in people and a moral trust by the people.